and we have elected officials at the federal level and at every other level who peddle conspiracy theories and have many, many folks voting for them. So we're hearing it from the highest levels, and that's very concerning for the future of our democracy. The other piece that is really concerning is that there's an enormous knowledge gap. And some of the training that Etzion speaks about relates to this, but there's an enormous knowledge gap about how all of the isms and obias function, right? How do they serve to destabilize communities? And an enormous knowledge gap in terms of what are they, right? That they are real. And when we have a population that is undereducated, that is going to threaten our democracy, right? That is the heart of our democracy, is our education as citizens.
Welcome to Pod Talks. Pod Talks is a project of protecting our democracy, where we bring together the best minds in New Jersey and beyond to talk about some of the biggest challenges facing our democracy, our institutions, and our personal freedoms. I'm Sean Spiller, Chair of Protecting Our Democracy. Today, with me I have Etzion Neuer, who is a Senior Deputy Regional Director and Director of Community Engagement for the Anti-Defamation League's New York, New Jersey office. In this capacity, Etzion has oversight over the region's incident response system, a network of trained staff who respond and resolve reports of anti-Semitism, discrimination, and civil rights issues. He has been with the ADL since 1999 in various roles, and we're thrilled to have him working in our region. Ariann Weitzman is Rabbi educator at Keshet, Reconstructionist Synagogue in Montclair. As a Jewish educator, Rabbi Weitzman works to help Jewish children and adults have both knowledge and pride to live their Jewish full lives. She has a deep personal interest in fighting anti-Semitism, racism, and misogyny, and understanding the connections between multiple forms. Rabbi Mendy Carlebach is the administrator of Rutgers Chabad and the director of Chabad North and South Brunswick. In addition, Rabbi Carlebach serves as the chaplain to many institutions, including the Port Authority of New York, the New York Police Department. He's also on the New Jersey Israel Commission. And I also see, I did read that you were chaplain for the Sydney Olympic Games, which is really, really cool. Rabbi Carlebach lives in South Brunswick with his wife and 3 children. And Linda Scherzer is the director of Jewish Community Relations Committee, Jewish Federation of Greater MetroWest. In that role, Linda is engaged in efforts to combat anti-Semitism, and on a parallel track works to promote social justice and racial equity. Linda received her Master of Journalism degree from Northwestern University School of Journalism and her undergraduate degree from Brandeis University. She lives in New Jersey with her husband and 3 children, and I want to welcome all of you today and thank you for being part of this important conversation.
Thank you.
To be here.
Etzion, maybe I'll start with you. We've been seeing a troubling increase in anti-Semitic violence here in New Jersey. That seems in some ways to align with the extremism and political violence that we're seeing across the country. What are you seeing? Can you share a little bit from your perspective at the ADL in terms of what you guys are tracking, what you're seeing locally, and of course, what you're seeing across the country?
Yeah, thanks for asking. The picture from New Jersey is it's not good. ADL does something called an annual audit of anti-Semitic incidents, and this is a study we've been doing for decades. And in 2021, ADL recorded a total of 370 incidents in New Jersey. That's the highest number ever recorded by ADL in the state, and it's the second highest number recorded in any state across the country last year. And New York had the first. So for context, the 370 incidents in New Jersey made up 14% of the total number in the United States. So New Jersey, small state, but big in anti-Semitism. And for an NJEA audience, I think it's particularly relevant to include some data on the schools. I can tell you that 22% of the New Jersey incidents were reported in K through 12 public schools. So it's 22% in schools, it's a lot. And maybe because I'm a dad, when it's 22% in the schools, it breaks my heart a little bit. We know that kids aren't born hating. This is something that's absorbed from the home, from friends, social media, and ultimately we want to have schools that are inclusive and that are safe. And it's almost tragic and disheartening when we see that. And what we see in New Jersey reflects the national trend. So nationally, we saw a high of all-time of anti-Semitic incidents last year or so. As goes New Jersey, goes the United States.
Following up with that, Weitzman, maybe I'll ask you this. New Jersey, we do pride ourselves on being a diverse state, right? We talk about it. We're one of the most diverse states in the nation. You're able to live in Montclair, a very progressive community. And yet we see a number of scary local incidents. You're hearing the data there. I'm hearing the data there on just how high New Jersey ranks in the number of anti-Semitic incidents that are reported. Do you have a sense that whether, when you're in a diverse state such as ours, communities that view themselves as pretty progressive in their values, does that make us a target? Does that make people engage in some of these activities when we see those higher numbers? What do you attribute some of that to?
There's a lot to say about those numbers. They're really frightening. Etzion, thank you so much for sharing them, and to the ADL for cataloging them year after year. So on one hand, I would expect a higher number in New Jersey simply because of population density and the density of the population of Jews, right? So we are going to experience more anti-Semitic instances because there are more targets. So that's not as surprising. That is what I would expect. I would expect far fewer in, Montana. Although there are Jews there and they experience anti-Semitism too, there are simply fewer. So that's one piece. The other piece is that in all kinds of ways, we do see when there is greater population density and greater diversity in a community that two opposite phenomena happen. One is that we see more instances of hate, and the other is that we see more instances of cooperation and in mutual support. And my community experiences that very much. We had a really frightening incident happen a couple of weeks ago at a nearby synagogue, and afterward, we had this outpouring of love from the community, which we have experienced over and over and over again, right? That is our common experience because we work so hard to create those bonds across difference. But we experience both of those things at the same time, right? We need those bonds even more because we are going to be greater targets of anti-Semitic violence, of bias incidents, of hate speech, etc. There are more of us. We are more visible. Some of us are very visible in various ways. And so that piece is not surprising because hate exists, right? That's like a reality of our lives. So I'm not surprised by those numbers, even though they're incredibly disheartening. And I didn't grow up in New Jersey. I grew up on the West Coast in a very small Jewish community, relatively speaking, and experienced an incredible amount of anti-Semitism in my childhood in that community. And in part of that is because of the isolation of that community, right? So we were a particular target because we were visible as being different from the typical residents of our community. So, there's a lot of factors that go into why those numbers are higher, but it's unfortunately not surprising.
I appreciate you helping kind of break some of that down, and obviously some of that quite logical, and then of course some of the pieces that you note in terms of when any group is isolated for sure, but being a target in some ways, when it's very visible and easy to identify, that becomes a challenge. I guess I'd try to put that in historical context. I think often we have short memories in terms of how, I guess slowly, extremism kind of creeps into society, like sneaks up on a society. I guess I would describe it as when we're seeing more and more things become acceptable. For me, it's, and I'm sure for many of you as well, when you start to see, former presidents, let's say a Trump, dining with, neo-Nazis, and, that's just not unacceptable by everyone. When you see, other things that occur where you're like, wow, only a few short years ago, it would seem like people would be, outraged universally. And yet sometimes there's a little bit of hedging going on now, I guess, Linda, maybe I'd go to you as someone with a perspective around journalism and now where you are, where do you see where we stand in the context of history? I mean, it's oftentimes easier to say, I remember when, and it was never like this, but oftentimes we get caught up in that. Where are we at really? And how much is creeping in here? And what type of threat do we see that's being created by moments like the way I just described or other things that we're seeing?
Thanks, Sean. Good to be with you, and good to be with such respected colleagues of mine in New Jersey. So the part of my bio that wasn't mentioned is that I used to work for CNN. I was an on-air correspondent, and that was in the dark ages when there was only 24-hour news networks on television. Today, social media. This gives us the ability to be reading and engaging 24/7. And it obviously, social media amplifies all the hate that's out there. and makes it exceedingly difficult for us to be able to combat it in dark corners, online. It's hard for me to give an historical perspective per se, but I do want to address some of the things that I'm seeing happening in the catchment area that we're responsible for, which is Essex, Morris Union, Sussex, and Somerset counties. I mean, Etzion gave you the big numbers. I want to drill down and tell you what we're seeing, particularly in the schools, because how is anti-Semitism expressing itself? It's expressing itself, largely with swastikas that are etched in desks, that are painted on lockers, that are written, in bathrooms. Some of it may be copycat, and some of it's fueled by, the just immaturity of young people who don't understand, what a swastika means. What I think is important to note is that in each of our spaces, we're pushing back in important ways. Whether it's the interfaith relationships that Rabbi Ariann is doing in her community, that we're doing, community-wide, understanding that the only way that you can really address hate is by forging relationships with people who don't know us. Right after the hostage taking incident in Texas a little over a year ago, Rabbi Charlie, talked about the importance of the, monthly dialogue groups and breakfasts and breaking bread with people of different faiths, because the more that people know us, the harder it is, to hate. So we do that in the Federation, where, my department is called Community Relations. It's embedded in the very name of the title of my position. And we do that, across communal lines, across interfaith and interethnic lines, with elected leaders, with law enforcement. Those forging of alliances is super important to what we do. And in addition to that, we have a security, infrastructure that works with synagogues and with our Jewish nonprofits to strengthen the doors of the synagogues. I mean, thankfully, miraculously, what happened at congregation near Tamid in Bloomfield 2 or 3 weeks ago, everything worked the way it was supposed to work because of the security infrastructure and the hardening of that target that was put in place thanks to nonprofit security grant funding and the work of good people and good institutions.
Yeah, no question. It was noted, I think a number of times, that thank goodness for some of that funding in that instance and in many others. Sticking with that, we're talking about our students, talking about social media, kind of looking there, and you could probably talk about a lot of spaces. But Rabbi Carlebach, I'd go to you next. Maybe you're at Rutgers University. It's our flagship university. Obviously, anti-Semitism and experiences there and threats that are there as well. How are you seeing, though, the intersection with today's students, specifically students in the Jewish community? But how's everyone handling at the college level there what's happening, and in what ways are you, the university, supporting them?
Okay, first of all, thank you so much for having me and join this illustrious group. Here on campus, we're trying to discern between anti-Semitic acts and Rutgers being known as an anti-Semitic university, which it's not. We have a dormitory here at the Chabad house, and we interview everyone before they come to live here. And one of the questions I get most frequently asked by parents is, what's going on campus? And parents are honestly afraid. They're hearing as if Rutgers is anti-Semitic, and Rutgers is not anti-Semitic. There are anti-Semitic acts that take place, or there are sometimes stupid statements made by faculty or some, when it pertains to the Israel situation. But Rutgers by no means is an anti-Semitic institution, and sadly we have to dispel that a lot of times. But we do support the students. In fact, we actually just had last week a roundtable between all the Jewish groups on campus, Chabad, Hillel, RJX, and the university. And we all sat down, and we're going to be the advisory group to the university that when an act does take place, how to respond to it, how the community comes together, and how to counter that. Students come to us and we have all types of students. So we have students that come to us that are religious, students that are not religious, students that are not interested in religion at all, just want a free meal, and they come into the Chabad house. So, we deal with it on many different levels, from students that identify the way they dress, the way they look as Jewish, and those that don't, that experience anti-Semitism by hearing something that someone says, or feeling that they may not feel safe on campus for whatever reason that may be. We've been here for a long time. We work with the administration, and I think one of the important things is to develop those relationships, just like Linda said, is to have that open door policy with your local, whether it's the administration of the university or law enforcement, and be able to pick up the phone and have someone that you know on a first name basis when there is that issue that takes place, and be able to resolve it that way. And thank God we have that here. We have a good administration now. Dr. Holloway, who's the president, we have direct line of communication with his office, the chief of police here at Rutgers University, whose last name is Kopp. He knew what he was going to be growing up. But we have a great relationship with those people to be able to address these concerns immediately, right when they come up, because that's what's most important, is to be able to right away have someone to call and to address whatever the concerns are.
Sean, if I may jump in real quickly, because I think Rabbi Mendy absolutely is describing, what he describes at Rutgers is absolutely true. And there is rich Jewish life on that campus, led in part by Rabbi Mendy and Chabad and Hillel, and thousands of Jewish students on campus who never experience the kinds of anti-Semitism that we're seeing outside the campus gates.
But there's a whole other piece to this. It was mentioned before, I believe, and Etzion, maybe I'll go to you on this, with social media, right? There's another layer that can be added to this that doesn't have to happen, face to face or in proximity even. It's something that can follow you around, no matter where you go. We all have our devices, and certainly kids especially, and how often and how much time they spend on them. I guess from your perspective, what are you seeing in terms of what's happening on social media? How easy it is for anti-Semitic groups to kind of connect and unfortunately attack children. What you guys are doing to kind of track that work, track as part of that work, and push back against what we're seeing in terms of hate speech on the internet and things of that nature.
Yeah, so Linda broached the subject of social media, and I think if you're going to ask me, one of the most important questions or follow-ups to this that frames this whole conversation about anti-Semitism is why? What's going on here? Why the increase? And if I'm going to address that question, I think this is appropriate time to try to do that. I think I'd start with, and there's it gets speculative and there's a science to it, but I think anecdotally and from a scientific perspective, you want to look at, number one, I would lead with social media. Look, it's an enormous driver of hate. Social media gives people a voice. It creates a democratization of society, but it gives here's that voice that in the old days, if you wanted to peddle your wares, as it were, if you were an anti-Semite, if you were an extremist, and you tried to get into mainstream media, you were blocked effectively by editors, right? There was a sort of system in place that forced people to, let's say, to the sidewalks, or who had to literally stand on a soapbox, or they had to send, advertise in the back of fringe magazines to sell their newspapers. You really were limited in how you could get your message out. Civil society acted as a check. And what it did was it forced extremism to the fringes of society. Social media no longer requires permission. You could push it out, and you can create communities, and you can radicalize others. Right, so people become radicalized online. There are examples of it abound. What happened in Carlebach was someone who was radicalized online, and we see examples of it all over the place. Social media is largely self-regulated, right? Facebook, TikTok, Twitter, right? Snapchat. They set their own rules. There's legislation that was created in the 1990s that regulates it, and it remains an enormous challenge. And in this framework, and also I would talk about polarization of society, which is certainly fed by social media. We live in a society that is increasingly divided. And in a divided society, it's harder to control the hate. I mentioned the fact that this trying to force hate to the fringes. Traditionally, when you try to force it to the fringes, there was a centralized, almost group agreement about that. In a divided society, people take sides. When they take sides, they tend to excuse the hate that's on their side, but everything on the other side is bad. In terms of right-left, we see this all the time. In an increasingly divided society, the result is it has allowed hate to creep into the center. We need people on the left to challenge hate on their side and those on the right to do the same thing. And then we've also seen, and they all follow one another, it's an emboldening of extremists. Extremists who, for whatever reason, speculated that maybe as we get further and further away from the Holocaust, there's a lessening of shame or a lessening of a stigma about anti-Semitism. But there is not the same level of social pressure behind the views of extremists. So we have white supremacists who feel emboldened. They have a group called the Goyim Defense League. Okay, right after Kanye, they hung a banner over a major highway, said Kanye was right, and they advertised their website, a website that sells merchandise. These are not people that are cloaking themselves in white hoods. They are proudly identifying they're going online, and you wouldn't have seen this years ago. This is not anecdotal. This is documented. We document the number of leafleting and flyering that we're seeing of hate groups. It's grown tenfold in the last few years. And by the way, it's not just affecting the Jewish community; it's affecting others as well. And these are all trends that are happening nationally, and in fact, are happening here in New Jersey as well.
Well, Linda, Rabbi Weitzman, I go to you guys in terms of that work to combat anti-Semitism. Is tied to social justice, racial equity. It's it's tied to so many forms of systemic oppression. We hear the challenge there and the problem. We hear a little bit of the solution of, hey, we need those, in those spaces to criticize, and those on the other space to criticize when things are inappropriate. But how do we get that to happen, right? It's not just happening. In fact, it seems to be moving further away from that. What can we do? What can we do as part of our broader community work to ensure that people are stepping in and stepping up in these spaces and speaking out when they see something that's wrong? Or what is the answer, in your opinion, as we do this work broadly?
Okay. Just one more little piece about social media and why we might be seeing more anti-Semitism in that space. Everything Etzion said about the technology of social media and the way that it operates as a rule, right, fosters this kind of conversation. But there's also a general moving of the Overton window, right? The kinds of conversations that are acceptable in our larger community, in society, from the highest levels of government has shifted and continues to shift, right? So we're seeing that trickle down at all levels. And it's not only social media, it's not only the functions of the internet, it's not only what politicians say, it's all of these things sort of encouraging each other. And also, particularly around anti-Semitism, the way anti-Semitism functions cyclically in societies historically, when we see greater disparities, when we see greater polarization, when we see greater wealth disparity, greater opportunity disparity, that's often the place where anti-Semitism comes in as a conspiratorial solution, right, to those issues for people who want to latch on to conspiracy theories, right? So we're seeing that a lot via the internet. I want to say that the only way that I really know how to fight anti-Semitism is by reaching across lines of difference, by making sure that people know who I am. Right? Making sure people know what Judaism is, who Jews are, what our story is, and having relationships that are close enough that those people feel emboldened to step up when they see anti-Semitism, right? So Jews are not going to solve anti-Semitism. In the same way that, African Americans are not going to solve anti-Black racism, right? That's just not how that's going to work. Jews have a role to play in terms of living with the most pride and the most openly as Jews in society, making sure that we stay visible, making sure that we stay alive, right, in the way that we practice. But it's so important for us to build those connections across communities so that other people are coming to our defense, but more importantly, other people are even noticing anti-Semitism when it happens. Because it's often subtle. It's not always swastikas, right? It's not always violence against Jews, right? It's often a little bit more subtle than that in terms of the rhetoric that folks use, in terms of their explanations for why things are the way they are, in terms of, criticism of Israel, which, the way the rhetoric, anti-Semitic rhetoric can sneak into that conversation and often not be seen by people who are trying to have an honest conversation. And it's really important for our allies to see those things, right? To be awakened to them and to know how to call them out, to know how to say, I would like to keep criticizing Israel. However, the thing that you just said is unacceptable, and here's why. Right? So we need folks to be able to do that. So we need a lot of education to be happening. And many of us are very much engaged in that education and in that relationship building. But it's going to need a lot of us.
So I would say that Rabbi Ariann and her synagogue and other synagogues in the Montclair Bloomfield area are certainly among the leaders in the relationship building space and have done such incredible work in forging alliances and understanding. I can only really speak to the Jewish Federation and want to share a little bit about what we're doing because understanding the climate and knowing the importance of doubling down on the work that we're doing in alliance building. We have added a couple of positions to my department, one being a social justice associate who is working at forging alliances and creating dialogue groups among African-American teens in Newark, St. Benedict's Academy, and Jewish teens in Essex County. We're about to launch another dialogue group with adults to increase understanding of the roots of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, as well as historic racism, and just to bring people who would normally not know each other together to talk. And we may not always agree, but I think it's important that we meet and see each other. So we're doing a lot of that work, and I think that we all agree that anti-Semitism and hate, sadly, tragically, seems to be part of the human condition. And the ways that we combat it have to do, with making sure that our buildings, our institutions are properly protected. And we're making huge investments in that, not just in the Jewish community, but with neighboring institutions and communities as well. But over the long term, the importance of increasing our investment in reaching out to our neighbors, in whether it's over Jewish holidays, inviting people to celebrate with us at the Jewish New Year. We had an interfaith Rosh Hashanah. We had another one in December to celebrate Christmas and Hanukkah and other festivities and celebrations. Those things are really important, and they make us feel good at a time when so many of us are not feeling great as we see what's happening around us.
Rabbi Carlebach, I'd ask you, you're hearing a lot in terms of outreach and connection, across diverse thinking and communities. At Rutgers, and look, I know it's a little bit charged in terms of we're seeing often right now a push to limit what kids are able to learn about and what they're able to study. But at Rutgers specifically, are you seeing formal programs that allow for connection with the broader community as a whole? What are you seeing that the university has there to kind of help with a little bit of what we're saying in a more formalized way?
I'm not seeing any, whether it's positive or negative in that sense. I believe that the students that are coming here to major in whatever they want to major in. They're coming to study, and some may experience acts of anti-Semitism, but as a whole, Rutgers is a wonderful place for a student to come, fulfill their dreams of majoring in whatever it is, and also be Jewish, whatever which way that is for that student. There's a great community here that's very inclusive, and I can't really speak to exactly what the curriculum at the university would be, whether that, as you asked, but I definitely do think that students that are coming to Rutgers can come and get their education here and be Jewish, simply Jewish here at the New Brunswick campus. This is the first, Linda, I'm hearing about what's the issues at Newark. I want to follow up on that myself, and see what can be done about that, because that does worry me quite a bit, and that brings up Camden. I'd like to know what's going on the Camden campus as well. But I would like to if I could talk about the bringing the connections that you have, that you develop, whether it's interfaith connections with law enforcement to be able to combat all this. As I said earlier today, I had the Homeland Security Interfaith Advisory Council, and it's the executive board. There's 10 members, and there was a comment made by one of the members, which I actually found it to be somewhat anti-Semitic, and I did have to speak up. Whereas the message was said that if this community had a certain act, it's handled this way, but in some other community, like if there was an act that happened in Lakewood, it would be handled very differently. And when I heard that, I was actually the only Jewish person around the table. I said, what do you mean by that? And I sort of challenged them, but what do you mean by that? It would be handled differently. And I wasn't really given a satisfactory answer. So it's very important to continue making the relationships, to speaking up whenever you do feel that there's, whether it's a comment like that made or an act of real anti-Semitism, to speak up, to develop those relationships that you have. I started on my own, not with any specific organization or program, bringing Holocaust survivors into police academies. I started this about 5 years ago with a fellow by the name of Ed Mossberg, who passed away just about three months ago, 96-year-old Holocaust survivor. I took him to 4 classes at the Port Authority Police Academy, took him to New Jersey State Police. The reason is because only 10% of these young recruits even never heard of what the Holocaust was. And that's a frightening number. And if they're the ones that are going to be responding to acts of anti-Semitism, to someone writing scribbling a swastika, and they don't understand what a swastika is, what the meaning behind it is, then how can they effectively patrol our streets? How can they keep society safe? We need to do more on the education part and really explain why we have such a the Jewish people do feel at times, hey, we were a very small minority, and we are the ones that are being targeted time and time again.
Well, I certainly think, one of the things that you'd mentioned just a little bit earlier too, when you sat in the meeting and heard a comment like that, I think it does tie a lot of things together here. There's that, in that moment, and the important piece of calling out what you see in an inappropriate statement that's made. I think, that's one of the themes here. And then also the ability to call in because of relationships. I think all of you are talking about in building, where you can call out when you see something wrong, but then call in, those individuals and those relationships that you have to say, what can we do about this? How can we use this to make sure people grow and of course, learn and change as needed. So I think important kind of themes, and certainly everything you guys have all said today. I really appreciate it. I guess I'd leave everybody with one last question, maybe go, rapidly around and just ask. We talk a lot about, why this is impactful, the importance of discussing and changing. But is there a direct threat to our democracy? There's a talk about that a lot of times, that this is a threat to our democracy. How would you frame if you thought there is a direct threat to our democracy?
Well, I'll take a stab at it. I think that there's a direct threat if what we're seeing today is allowed to grow and flourish. It's hard for me to believe that in the United States of America, in a country like ours, in a democracy that has thrived and leader of the free world, it's rather hard for me to imagine that we can allow or will allow hate to grow in ways that are going to threaten our democracy. But I do think that hate unchecked can ultimately lead in that direction down a very dark path. That being said, I do feel that I need to recognize the fact that among our chief supporters and the people who are first in line to denounce hate have been our elected leaders. And here's where social media is used for good. When there is an event, an incident, whether it's an attempted firebombing of a synagogue or a swastika on a schoolyard, I go through my social media feed, and I'm always finding tweets and messages of support from our state, federal, local leaders. Our law enforcement has stood shoulder to shoulder with us. Only today, there was a lockdown, apparently a brief one, for all Livingston schools. And our chief security officer, Bob Wilson, was in direct contact with a colleague of his in the Livingston Police Department, and within minutes was able to find out that actually this was a false alarm. So I am incredibly grateful to our elected officials, to law enforcement, and I believe that while hate may be part of the human condition, I also believe that there's a lot of good in the world, and we're seeing that as well.
Yeah. Well, unless anyone else feels they want to offer a piece on that.
Yeah, I think, look, anti-Semitism is one part of a broader worrying trend that we're seeing. And if I may, just broaden the hate a little bit, I think it's appropriate to do that. ADL does focus on anti-Semitism. There's a broader piece of ADL as well. And I think when we look at our democracy, there are threats. We can refer to either voter suppression that happens, and we have the mainstream of extremism, and we have the immigration and refugee rights that are being weaponized. So, and when hate and conspiracy theories can spread virally on social media, you have this backdrop of anti-Semitic incidents. The experts in democracy and political violence are warning that the nation is moving towards some kind of a hybrid democracy. You have a growing risk of autocracy. You have, I refer to this hyper-polarization and division. And I think for Jews and other minorities and marginalized communities, there's a real fear and a real danger. The Jewish community historically has felt that when there's a destabilization of the government, Jews are often feel at first as some kind of a weird sort of canary in a coal mine effect. And it's something that's felt acutely here as our studies show that with the increasing higher attitudes of anti-Semitism felt in the United States, there's a really rapidly feeling of unease and discomfort with what's going on, and it's destabilizing and worrisome. So I think we all have our work cut out for us, and part of it is we need to ask our elected officials to speak out strongly. We need to embolden them, all of our leaders, to do that, and we need to hold social media companies accountable for what's going on. And we need to work within our school systems. We have the systems. We can bring in programs and training for young people to start young before an incident happens. We have our systems that are in place. We have good people here. We hear it time and again, this concern that are we seeing the 1930s of Germany happening? I understand why the comparison is made. But ultimately, it's a false comparison. Our leaders, starting with the president and moving to governors and other elected officials, have showed up here They've spoken out against anti-Semitism and hate. And ultimately, while we are concerned, we have a lot of reason to be hopeful, and that the people on this call, the leadership we have, consistently fighting back and forming the relationships to ultimately give us some hope for the future.
I would say while I mostly feel good about our elected officials in terms of their responsiveness to anti-Semitism in particular, I don't feel entirely great about that. And we have elected officials at the federal level and at every other level who peddle conspiracy theories and have many, many folks voting for them. So we're hearing it from the highest levels, and that's very concerning for the future of our democracy. The other piece that is really concerning is that there's an enormous knowledge gap. And some of the training that Etzion speaks about relates to this, but there's an enormous knowledge gap about how all of the isms and obias function, right? How do they serve to destabilize communities? And an enormous knowledge gap in terms of what are they, right? That they are real. And when we have a population that is undereducated, that is going to threaten our democracy, right? That is the heart of our democracy, is our education as citizens. So that's my primary concern.
Yeah, well, certainly as I think we're engaging in a lot of these conversations, and I'll just say, speak for myself, in different spaces where we are talking about, book bannings in some instances and limiting information in others, and all of these things coming together. I think everybody on here is correct. We know that, and as an educator, knowledge is power. We've got to make sure people are aware and knowledgeable, and we've got to make sure people speak up. Speak out when needed, engage in the conversations with the relationships built. And I guess we'd leave it with, we all have to be aware of there's love and hate, right? And there's a lot of hate out there, but we're hopeful that with love and the work that all of you are doing and so many others are doing as well, we're able to bring forward that other, absolute human trait as well, and characteristics of love, and hopefully win out in that sense as well. So a lot of work to do. I think everyone's on guard for sure, and certainly troubled by what we're seeing. Know there's work to be done, but hopefully successful again. So I thank you all for having the conversation today. I appreciate you guys giving some time. So thank you.
Thank you.